President Yoon Suk-yeol is in the U.S. to attend the NATO summit, which pundits say comes at a very crucial time. So why is this latest security summit so significant? What are the broader implications of South Korea's partnership with NATO going forward? Also, how does the result of the U.S. presidential election in November look to affect NATO? Hello and welcome. It's Tuesday, July 9th here in South Korea, and you're watching Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Security takes center stage this week in Washington, D.C. as global leaders at NATO seek a joint stance against unprovoked acts of aggression. For more on this, I have Celio Fioretti, a correspondent for Croix, here in the studio. Celio, it's good to have you back.
Glad to be here.
I also have Jacco Zwetsloot, host of NK News podcast, here in the studio with us as well. Jacco, welcome back.
Thank you.
Celio, the annual NATO summit kicks off in Washington, D.C. this week. Let's begin with some details regarding the agenda.
Yes, from July 9th today, actually, to July 11th, the 32 member states of NATO will join for the annual summit in Washington, D.C. this time. It's quite symbolic. It's the 75th anniversary of the treaty signed right after the Second World War. Originally with 12 countries. This summit comes at a perilous time for NATO, actually, with the alliance facing a war in Europe and also several global crises. According to Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, the Washington summit will focus on three main points. First, the core business of NATO, boosting defense and deterrence between the allies. And the second is supporting Ukraine, which is the most critical point this year, supporting Ukraine in its effort against Russian invasion. And finally, the third point is to increase and extend partnerships, NATO's partnership, especially in the Indo-Pacific area, and that's where South Korea comes in. South Korea is part of the IP4, four countries invited to the NATO summit that are part of the Indo-Pacific region. So we have Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. President Yoon Suk-yeol will be attending the summit. It is expected that NATO will presumably talk about the North Korea-Russia treaty that was signed earlier. Japan will also talk about it. So they will review it, and maybe we'll see some announcement on that. But Ukraine will be the most centerpiece, and see how NATO members can support Ukraine. Some argue that Ukraine should be part and be integrated into NATO. I don't think we'll see that during the summit, as NATO will probably not integrate a member that is currently at war. But still, NATO is definitely siding with Ukraine and preparing ground maybe for future integration. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, is also pushing hard for more extensive aid to Ukraine with a 5-year, $100 billion military commitment to Ukraine. We'll see how this turn out with the European partners.
Right, and staying with NATO's commitment to Ukraine, Jacco, do you suppose South Korea should seek to perhaps provide Ukraine with lethal weapons, especially keeping in mind North Korea's open support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, that's a difficult and provocative question, but let's try to answer it. Way back in 2022, when Russia's war on Ukraine was still in its early phases, North Korea's foreign ministry blamed it on the United States and the West, citing hegemonic high-handedness and abuse of power against other countries. More recently, last month, at the time of Vladimir Putin's visit to Pyongyang, North Korea promised full support and solidarity for the Russian government, army and its people in the war against Ukraine. Then, just after Putin's visit, one of North Korea's top military officials, Park Jong-chun, was quoted by Reuters as saying that Russia has the right to opt for any kind of retaliatory strike if America continued its support for Ukraine in what he called America's proxy war against Russia. Now, Park even hinted that it could lead to a new world war. Now, after the signing of Russia and North Korea's new pact to defend each other in the event of war, an official from the South Korean president's office said that South Korea would now consider sending arms to Ukraine. That statement was a little bit over 10 days ago, and we still have no firm announcement as I recall. So when I checked last night, the most recent report said that President Yoon would look at the level and substance of military cooperation between Russia and North Korea before making a decision. That still suggests that we are some way off from an actual export of arms to Ukraine. But as a foreigner living in this country, I'm not about to tell South Korea what is in its national interest. But its government, under President Yoon Suk-yeol, it wants to be taken seriously as a global pivotal state and a major player in world affairs. And if so, it may want to think about taking a stronger stance and a more practical stance in supporting Ukraine in its self-defense and also countering Russia's naked imperialist aggression. Or it should make a better and more public explanation about why it's choosing not to do so.
Right. Meanwhile, Celio, this latest NATO summit also reportedly comes against the backdrop of prospects of far-right European governments unfriendly to NATO coming to power. How valid do you suppose are these concerns?
Well, it's true there's a growing anti-NATO sentiment in Europe, especially mostly from the far right. Sadly, in the last year, we've seen the far right rising and getting closer to power or taking it in some countries. Thankfully, France this weekend managed to keep it out of power, but still it remains a threat both in France and in the rest of Europe. This unfriendly sentiment is also carried by Russian influence in Europe and in these far-right parties, whether it's through think tanks or funding. But I think the situation with this unfriendly NATO sentiment is also coming from a feeling of imbalance in the alliance. Europe would like to endorse more responsibility. They still feel that the US is the sole leader in the alliance. They feel they try hard, but they don't get credited enough. For example, only 7 out of the 13 countries managed to get their 2% share of the GDP dedicated to defense, as the US asked. So it's still quite a difficult thing to do for most European countries with a smaller economy than the US. And whether Washington feels there's a sentiment of disconnection between Washington and the rest of Europe is grounded in reality or not, that's really not the question, but Washington will have to deal with that sentiment if they want to keep the European by the side. When Europe starts to talk about a Europe defense organization, a possible Europe defense organization, the US view it as a competitor to NATO. So there is a strong desire since the war in Ukraine broke out for European countries to invest in their own defense. And some countries are reluctant to do so as they feel the US, it would jeopardize their relationship with Washington. Beyond defense policies in Europe, EU countries will also like to have more autonomy in their relationship with countries like China, for example. So for better or worse, these demands and these worries need to be taken into account by Washington if they want to work with Europe and make the alliance last.
Right. Meanwhile, Jacco, South Korea, as Celio mentioned earlier, has been invited to the NATO summit for the 3rd straight year. What are the gains of a greater alignment with NATO for South Korea, and vice versa? How does the engagement with South Korea serve the Western security alliance, do you think?
Yes, so I'll list some of the areas in which NATO and South Korea are cooperating together, and these are cyber defense, arms control and non-proliferation, new emerging and disruptive technologies, and also counter-terrorism. So the gains for both sides are an increasing understanding of how the other acts in those areas and how they counter the threats that exist in those 4 areas, but also will help both sides to increase capacity in those areas and to institutionalize the collaboration and the cooperation so that they'll hopefully last beyond the short term but into the middle and long term. And the other idea, I think, is that what they call interoperability, which is a very popular word when they talk about military cooperation. That means the ability of civilian and military personnel on both sides to work within and with the systems of the other side. So they understand the structures, the technologies that the other side is using, and can also use them themselves if necessary. And then we've seen some real practical benefits of things like that. For example, the Korean Navy working with NATO to counter piracy in the Gulf of Aden. So that's a very practical area there. Now, as Celio mentioned, South Korea is not the only partner that NATO has invited from the Indo-Pacific region. There's also Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, each of which has their own level of involvement in and cooperation with NATO. Now, this is part of a broader strategic alignment, I think, between the NATO alliance, which is, after all, as the name suggests, based around the North Atlantic Ocean, and also other nations with similar common interests and values in the Indo-Pacific region.
Right. Celio, do you suppose a potential shift in the US with regard to leadership this November will greatly affect the NATO framework?
Yeah, one of the issues of this NATO summit is, at least for the US, how to prepare for the worst case scenario without making it look like a pre-written defeat. The summit comes right at the heart of the presidential campaign, and Biden didn't look that great after the first presidential debate. So he needs to use this summit as a way to promote his candidacy and also his policy. But he cannot pretend as a shift will not be possible in November. If Trump wins the election, there will be changes, but one would be very smart to know how and when will these changes happen. Last year, Biden administration passed a bill to make it harder to leave NATO, so that's one safeguard. But Trump could just play the empty chair policy and just refuse to participate or fund NATO. He has many ways to mingle with the alliance. Strategic weapon, also military training. I mentioned before the issue between Europe and the US about NATO. I think this is one way of saving the alliance if Trump wants to retract from it. We might see a change of framework, but not necessarily from Trump, but from Europe. And I think Europe needs to change the framework to reinforce the European pillar of the alliance. So far, it has mostly been the US carrying the alliance. Of course, the European economies cannot fill the hole if the US leave the alliance, but we are not to this point yet. Europe can take more responsibility, and this would have two effects, actually. First, it would protect from any accidents caused by the craziness of the American politics if the decision is not only in the hands of Washington. And second, it would also ease the pro-Trump critics, saying that Europe is only profiting from US money. So Europe needs to show they can bear the burden of NATO, they can take responsibility and they can fund it, and Biden's need to recognize it too.
Right, so it would be an opportunity then for Europe to show its presence within that NATO framework then. Jacco, what about the Trilateral alliance among South Korea, Japan and the US? Does it look to be affected by a potential Trump administration?
Maybe not. It's hard to know for sure, of course, because Donald Trump is always and can be quite unpredictable in his statements and in his actions. But basically, people who are close to the Trumpian view of American politics would like to see South Korea, as well as Japan and other countries, we've already talked about NATO, pay for and be responsible for more of their own national defense. But that doesn't mean that they're opposed to the three countries working together to counter larger regional threats that affect US strategic interests. So where it is possible to imagine, for example, a future Trump administration security advisor recommending that the Republic of Korea take almost all of the burden and responsibility for its own defense against North Korea, it is also possible to imagine that same person suggesting to Donald Trump that South Korea, the United States and Japan work together trilaterally to counter regional aggression by, for example, China. Why? Because China is seen as a greater threat to the United States than North Korea is, both militarily and economically. Now, Donald Trump, in his previous term as president, had good relations with the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and they golfed together, and they watched sumo, and they ate barbecue together. Now, a re-elected Donald Trump, if that happens, and President Yoon may find that they have good chemistry too, and that could help to keep that trilateral good vibe between the United States and Korea on the one hand and Japan on the other continuing. But even though Trump is likely to want to adjust the alliances with both those countries to some extent, it doesn't mean that he's opposed to the idea of the three countries working together in a defensive way, especially when it doesn't cost the US any money.
Right, a good valid point there. Jacco, would it be possible then to perhaps hope for some breakthrough with regard to tensions on the Korean Peninsula under a potential Trump administration, especially keeping in mind, as pundits say, the fact that both Trump and Kim Jong-un appear to prefer a top-down approach to diplomatic affairs?
Yeah, this is something that a lot of people are wondering about. Now, of course, it is possible for Donald Trump to go back to the White House as president, and then it's possible that he might want to renew his friendship with Kim, starting a letter-writing campaign and perhaps suggesting a meeting. But Kim Jong-un now has his own renewed friendship with Vladimir Putin that is actually bringing him hard results that he wants to see. So Kim would have to decide what was more important to him. And he would probably want to see what is on the table first, as in what is Donald Trump going to offer this time round. Now, the last time they had a summit meeting, which was already in February 2019, so it's already 5.5 years ago, Kim didn't like the terms that he was being offered. So he stuck to his guns, or rather he stuck to his nuclear weapons, and Donald Trump called an early end to the meeting, and they both walked away. So Kim wants to see sanctions relief against North Korea, and he wants to see a deal that doesn't end up with him simply giving up all his nuclear weapons while hoping for the goodwill of the United States. So does that give much hope for a breakthrough? Not much, but life is full of surprises.
Right, hopefully. Celio, South Korea, Japan and the US recently held an inaugural multi-domain exercise called Freedom Edge, which North Korea condemned harshly. Could you tell us a bit about this latest drill and its broader implications?
Yes, at the end of last month, the US, Korea and Japan started their first trilateral military exercise called Freedom Edge. It really shows the new relationship between the three partners now, especially reinforced by the Washington Declaration last year. That's really cement this tripartite friendship, I would say, not call it an alliance too soon. Last August, President Yoon Suk-yeol, US President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida agreed to hold annual named multi-domain trilateral exercises on a regular basis during the summit at Camp David as part of efforts to deter evolving nuclear and missile threat from North Korea. The inaugural Freedom Edge drill involved a U.S. aircraft carrier, USS Roosevelt, and multiple Japanese and Korean ships and planes. This drill took place near Jeju Island, and for the first time took place across multiple domains. As Jacco said, the interoperability, it's including land, sea, air, and cyber, which is quite new, a crucial step toward allowing the country's military to work together in a more seamless way and a wider range of warfighting scenarios. North Korea condemned and started their own battery of tests. There was a little bit of uncertainty at first with a first test that Joint Chief of Staff said it was a missile launch that failed. The North Korea claimed it was in fact a three-headed missile that they were just testing. To make it simple, it's a missile that divides itself into smaller parts to attack multiple targets. There was another launch, and I think Jacco will tell us more about it.
Right, then let's stay with that, Jacco. So as Celio mentioned last Tuesday, North Korea claimed to have tested a new tactical ballistic missile capable of carrying a super large warhead. Now, South Korea cast doubt on this claim. Could you tell us a bit more?
Yes, we know that North Korea is looking to perfect what is called a MIRV, or MIRV, a multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle. So as Celio hinted at, that it's one missile with several warheads on top, each of which can go to its own target, thereby increasing the likelihood that at least one of those targets will be hit by a nuclear weapon, and also hoping to overcome anti-missile defense systems, because although you've only got one missile, you've got multiple bombs coming from it. And North Korea has been aiming at this for a while. They made it a top priority in technology development last year already, so we know that they've been looking at it. Now, the South Korean military did say that the weapon had exploded in mid-flight and said that it was a failure, and they pointed to a video that the South Korean military had made of the test. But South Korea also claimed that this test was of a hypersonic missile, which is something different, so rather than a MIRV. So, writing for NK Pro, analyst Ankit Panda pointed out that North Korea in its own words, had tested the first stage engine of an intermediate range solid fuel ballistic missile, which could carry out a launch designed to examine the flight characteristics of individual mobile warheads. So he pointed out that this test was exactly what we would expect to see, and that we can expect to see future tests down the road. For example, testing the structure that will sit at the top of the missile holding the independent warhead. So we haven't yet seen that, and we'll see more testing, I think, in the coming months and years until North Korea feels confident that it has a MIRV system that is fully capable and that is going to be successful on every launch. And then it can deploy them in numbers across its territory. Now, of course, the thing with MIRVs is, although you've got one missile, you have to have at least 3 bombs sitting on top of that. Now, North Korea may not yet have a lot of nuclear weapons at the size ready to sit on top of that warhead, but we don't, from the outside, we can't tell what's a real warhead and what's a decoy. So North Korea may actually play a clever move and deploy a number of these missiles around the country with warheads that look real, but they may, only one of them might be real, but we won't know until they're launched and until they're used. So that it can keep that going until it has built up enough of a stockpile of small nuclear warheads that can be fitted to the top of that missile.
Right, which is why we're even more concerned given its defense pact with Russia. All right then, Jacco, thank you very much for your time and thoughts today. And Celio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
Right, well, on that note, we say goodbye. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.